The story of George Parrott, also known as George Francis Worden and George Manus, and most famously Big Nose George, is a tale of an infamous outlaw who met a gruesome end, becoming the only man in American history who became a pair of shoes after his death. The notorious outlaw, known for his large nose, was a member of a gang of road agents and horse thieves who were active in the Powder River country of Wyoming. Led by a man named Sim Yan, the outlaws robbed pay wagons and stagecoaches of cash shipments and relieved passengers of their money and jewelry. The gang comprised of Frank McKinney, Joe Manus, Jack Campbell, John Wells, Tom Reed, Frank Toll, and Dutch Charlie Burris. The crew planned a train robbery on August 16th of 1878. The 7 gang members hid in a bush, waiting for the train to arrive, but some crew members for the section of train actually noticed that the rail had been tampered with. Frank McKinney wanted to shoot them, but Big Nose George and Frank Toll objected, saying they hadn't come to kill section men. Meanwhile, as the crew members repaired the track, a railroad foreman rode ahead to stop the approaching train and informed the law that the rails had been tampered with. The outlaws could do nothing but silently watch as the track was being repaired and rode off after the workers had left. A posse was soon sent to apprehend the would-be train robbers. 2 lawmen tracked the gang to Rattlesnake Canyon at Elk Mountain, where the outlaws shot and killed them. Afterwards, the gang split up, heading in various directions. After discovering the 2 dead lawmen, the Union Pacific Railroad doubled their efforts in tracking the murderers, and the county authorities offered a $10,000 reward for their capture. The gang's first member to be apprehended was Dutch Charlie in 1879. However, when the westbound train was bringing the outlaw to Rawlins for trial, it was stopped by a mob in Carbon, and Dutch Charlie was hanged from a telegraph. Frank Toll was killed the next month while trying to rob the Black Hills stage line. Big Nose George was the next to be caught, and his capture was particularly dramatic. While he was in Miles City, Montana, he got drunk and boasted of the attempted train robbery and murders in Wyoming. A telegraph was sent to Rawlins, and in July of 1880, Sheriff Rankin of Carbon County went to Montana to take George back to Wyoming. Again, as the train made its journey, it was stopped in Carbon by the same mob that had lynched Dutch Charlie. Big Nose was hauled off the train and prepared for lynching. However, when the outlaw began to plead for his life and confessed, promising to tell all he knew about the murders if they let him live, the vigilantes cut him down. Big Nose was then allowed to continue the journey on to Rawlins to stand trial. At George's trial, he was found guilty on December 15th of 1880 and sentenced to hang on April 2nd of 1881. However, George didn't plan to go so easily and actually attempted to escape on March 22nd of the following year. When he attacked jailer Robert Rankin, he fractured his skull and cut his scalp in the process. However, the day was saved when Mrs. Rankin appeared with a pistol in her hand, and Big Nose George was forced back into the jail. News of the daring escape started spreading through the town. A mass mob soon formed and stormed the jail with lynching in their minds. They dragged the outlaw, Big Nose George Parrott, from his jail cell to a telegraph pole on Front Street. A crowd of about 200 people gathered as the vigilantes attempted to hang Parrott, but they severely botched the first 2 attempts. It was on the 3rd try that Big Nose George finally died at the end of a rope. His body was left hanging for several hours until the undertaker removed it. But having no family to claim the corpse, 2 doctors, Thomas McGee and John Osborne, took possession of the body to study the outlaw's brain to determine if there might be a reason for his criminal behavior. Among them was 15-year-old Lillian Heath, who was working as Dr. McGee's assistant. The doctors crudely sawed off the top of Big Nose George's skull to examine it, but they actually found no difference between Big Nose George's brain and a normal, not criminal brain. However, even though this is a bizarre thing, it got even weirder. See, Dr. Osborne's activities went from weird to just bizarre. Dr. Osborne first molded a death mask of George's face using plaster from Paris. But it didn't have ears because George struggled at the end of a rope, and his ears were actually torn off. Next, Osborne removed skin from the dead man's thigh and chest and sent them to a tannery in Denver with a lot of strange instructions. The tannery was to use the skin, including the dead man's nipples, to make a pair of shoes and a medicine bag. When Dr. Osborne received the shoes, he was disappointed that they didn't include the nipples on the shoes. But he wore the shoes anyway. The rest of George's dismembered body was kept in a whiskey barrel, filled with a salt solution for about a year. Osborne continued to dissect and experiment from time to time. Finally, the whiskey barrel and outlaw remains were buried in the yard behind Dr. McGee's office. Despite the doctor's odd behavior and the desecration of George Parrott's body, he soon became prominent in local politics. He was elected the first Democratic governor of Wyoming and was said to have worn the shoes at his inaugural ball in 1893. Later, Osborne would become the Assistant Secretary of State under President Wilson. Somewhere along this line, the skullcap was given to the young assistant Miss Heath, who would later become the first female doctor in the state of Wyoming. Over the years, the skullcap was said to have served as an ashtray and a doorstop for her office. The incident was all but forgotten until construction workers excavated a new building on Cedar Street and unearthed a whiskey barrel filled with bones on May 11th, 1950. The location was behind the building that served as Dr. McGee's office years before. Inside the barrel were numerous human bones, including a skull with the top sawed off. In no time, a crowd gathered to look at the grisly remains. Someone remembered that Dr. Lillian Heath had kept the skullcap. While well into her 80s, Heath was still alive, and she was immediately contacted. When her husband brought the skullcap to the scene, it perfectly fit the skull that came out of the barrel. The locals were convinced that these were the remains of Big-Nosed George that had to do DNA testing to verify the result. If you're ever wandering the halls of the Carbon City County Museum in Rawlins, Wyoming, you might come across a display that sends shivers down your spine. It's kind of hard to miss, given that it contains that death mask of Big-Nosed George Parrott, the outlaw whose story had become kind of legend but kind of forgotten until they discovered the whiskey barrel in 1950. You can see the skull there, too. It's like it's frozen in time. And then there are the shoes. Let's not forget about the shoes, made from his skin. It's also with the skull and the death mask that sit on display. That's not all. In the corner of the exhibit, you'll find a watch. It's kind of unremarkable at first glance, but significant in its own right. See, this watch was given to Rosa Rankin, the woman who stopped Big-Nosed George from escaping the jail in 1881. It's a reminder of time long gone, when outlaws roamed the lands between right and wrong, was often blurred. For those who can handle this kind of grotesque thing, the Carbon County Museum is a must-visit. It's not the only place you can actually get a taste of Big-Nosed George's story. The Union Pacific Museum in Omaha, Nebraska houses the shackles that were used on him during the hanging, along with his skullcap. And yet, despite all these artifacts, there are still parts of the outlaw's story that remain shrouded in mystery. His tanned skin, I don't know if you remember that part. The tanned skin fashioned into a medicine bag has never been found, and the rest of his remains, allegedly buried in secret, have yet to be uncovered. But in a way it only adds to the mystique of the little-known outlaw named Big-Nosed George. His legend is going to live on for a very long time.